Hello and welcome to the second episode of our podcast called The Internet Seriously. Our job is to try and make sense of the internet and also have a laugh. So this episode we're going to be talking about the new Labour Manifesto that's just been published yesterday, particularly focusing on the area of what that means for tech, for the tech industry. Then we've got an announcement this week of the new ICANN CEO. Kieren will be talking a bit about that, and Emily will be joining us talking generally about what's happening at ICANN. For those of you that don't know what ICANN is, it's the organisation that's at sort of the top of the internet naming and numbering system, and we'll go a bit more into that and why it's relevant and why we're talking about that. First of all, the Labour Manifesto was published yesterday, and it was actually quite interesting. It actually dealt with some subject matters that are pertinent to the tech industry. As some of you may know, Kieren McCarthy, who's joining us in this podcast, is actually standing as a Lib Dem candidate. So we're really fascinated with the politics at the moment. I don't know, Kieren, if the Lib Dems have anything on tech specifically, but before I let you answer that, I want to sort of contrast the Labour manifesto on tech with the Tory manifesto that was earlier this week, which critics are describing as a missed opportunity. One journalist I said was they do the usual mentioning AI and digital, and as a technical expert I think AI and digital is something that people say who don't really understand about engineering, and it makes them sound like they're good at tech. But it was felt that the Tory manifesto was, very generalised, very broad. They're going to invest in digital transport and energy infrastructure required for growth. So not really saying any of the detail at all.
Was that the only mention of tech in the Tory manifesto?
That was the only. It was sort of broad brushstrokes, and it's regarded as just general, wishy-washy and very, very broad. Now, if we look at the specifics that attracted me about the Labour manifesto, relaxing planning for data centres, easier for startups to bid for government contracts, new AI safety rules, and a new national data library. Now, all of those are quite, they trigger interest for me. I was listening to a really interesting podcast a couple of days ago focusing on the reform voters and talking to some reform voters in the streets. And apart from a sort of torrent of like everything bordering from dissatisfaction, which is understandable, especially for the poorer communities, all the way to just barefaced racism, one thing that people were saying was that they didn't feel there was any game changers, any specifics. Now, as a tech, I don't know what you two feel, but I think some of these proposals are potential game changers. I think they can really affect growth if the Labour Party come into power. Emily, what do you think about? Is there anything that jumps out at you with that? It was data, relaxed planning for data centres. Let's just start with that. What they're saying is that people are finding it hard to build data centres. Yeah. I as a technologist find that our data processing and cloud data is the most expensive thing we buy. There are 3 or 4 companies running the whole game.
So what I think about it is that, we know that, if you study the infrastructure, that if you bring the infrastructure close to the user, you're going to get better performance, lower latency, lower costs. But also that, partly to deal with ever-present cyber attacks or whatever the threat, small companies like ours are under constant pressure to bulk up, to go to the big cloud providers, and that's actually having a consequence of consolidating the market. So anything that you can do to bring down the costs and make local availability of data centres, it almost sounds like somebody in the Labour team has actually thought about tech, which is quite unusual.
Well,
Kieren, how much is that happening in the Lib Dem campaign? What's the Lib Dem campaign saying about tech?
Well, the truth is, it's not happening within the Labour Party. It's happening outside with the think tanks. There's several good think tanks that have been lining up for about a year, knowing that Labour is almost certainly going to come in, and have been putting forward some pretty good tech policies. Tony Blair's institute in particular has been very good on tech. What's interesting is that I'll get to the Lib Dem question in a second. But what's interesting is that not a lot of it actually makes it through to the manifesto.
Yeah.
And as always with tech, that's for two reasons. One is that political leaders don't really understand technology, and so they don't think it's that important, or not as important as NHS or what the other issues are they want to focus on. And I think that's a mistake, but that's their judgment call. And then secondly, technology just, by its nature is usually not so much anti-government, but definitely not something that it ever sort of seeks government intervention or advice on. So usually most of the tech advice that is provided to people is basically, you need to do this, but stay away from it. And people in manifestos don't very much like saying, what we pledge to you is that we'll stay out the way. So
Kieren,
they tend not to include it.
Last week we talked to you about what you were hearing on the doorstep in your campaign to be elected in Putney as a Lib Dem, and I was a bit surprised that technology is just not coming up on the doorstep. Is that still your finding? And then we've given you enough time to think about what the Lib Dems are saying about it in their manifesto, so you can cover that too.
Well, it's a slightly strange thing, and I think it's one of these things, it would be on people's minds. As soon as you start, people ask me what I do. And then when I say, the sort of the work that I do, they go, oh, and then we have a whole conversation about, mostly social media, but also sometimes.
Sorry, I think you had a GitHub desktop comment box appearing asking you to log in, but just apologies for anyone who actually watches this podcast rather than listens to it. Sorry, Kieren.
I'm not logging into GitHub today. So people are interested when you start talking about it, but it's one of these strange things. The media as well is not very good at talking about tech unless it's sort of in extreme terms about what's terrible and how it's all going to be awful. They're not very good at digging into the actual stuff that rules much of our lives. And so a combination of politicians not really getting it or wanting to talk about it, and the media not really getting it and not wanting to talk about it. So you end up with, people on the doors typically don't want to talk about it, or at least, don't talk about it. But when you start talking to them about it, they're off and running. So there is this big tech disconnect. This is stuff that impacts our lives, every day. I mean, the number of times all of us look at our phones is wild. So there is this disconnect, and we really do need to get a grip of it. And the only thing that's really taken off recently has been this sort of AI, and there has been some good work, and the Lib Dems have actually been doing some good work on AI. But mostly it's sort of very broad brush stuff.
What are the Lib Dems saying about AI or technology or in general?
The focus has been on AI because I think that the Lib Dems have a very strong view about liberalism, as you would expect, the sort of the ability to use technology to make people's lives better, and also limit the amount that the government controls or intervenes in it. So the Lib Dems got very interested in AI because they see the possibilities, and they don't want regulation to be too heavy-handed, while also making sure, of course, that it doesn't become a societal mess. And so they took a big interest in this AI. And then, I've been to a few of the sessions talking about it, and there's not been bad. There's been a gradual increase in understanding of AI. But is it ready for prime time? Is it the sort of thing that I'd want to see, going anywhere near Parliament? Not yet. No way.
I mean, as an engineer, I am interested in not AI, the old machine learning, which is just big database crunching. We're all talking about it as though it's a new thing. It's a technology that depends upon the hardware and the networking. And in that Labour manifesto, you've got, AI safety rules. Relaxed planning for data centres. Now, I'm really interested in that because data centres eat the planet's power. You know, if you go into a data center, we used to do what we call metal box servers, and we'd go in there with spanners and suits on, and the place is roaring power. It's like speed cars driving full pelt all the time. If their air conditioning fails, you've got to panic because they start to cook those boxes. And we move to cloud with joy, but we still want to do machine learning and AI, but we find it costs so much.
Yeah.
And now we've got a Labour manifesto pledge, which is saying a national data library which would afford AI. Now, are we going to be able, as small businesses, you know, as one of those businesses on your high street in Putney, you've got 28 of them closed, love the video. I'm thinking, you know, if any of them want to go online and get into AI and data processing, are they really going to be able to afford to use a new national data library and new data centers? That's my big question. Or is it just a way of paving the way for the big incumbent data providers, the data overlords, to just get more and more data locally?
Well, I think the access to training data for AI, you know, it may or may not work, but I think it's actually quite a detailed policy point. I was surprised to see it, and it is a really important issue, because the next generation of leaders in AI are going to be the ones that already have all of the data. And so if you want new market entrants, if you want to shake up the market a little bit, then you need to sort of resolve what they call data poverty from startups. And so that was a very interesting point of detail there. I think another thing that we don't really talk about enough with technology, and AI is a real example, is the environmental load that it places. And so, you know, the data centers, you know, when you go into them, the things that really strike you are the screaming noise, the heat, and the sort of resources that are put to play to sort of cool things down and heat things up at the same time. So they're incredibly resource hungry.
So relaxed planning for data centers is almost like a third runway at Heathrow around and near the motorway. So it's interesting how that's going to fit with their eco policy. So just moving on, we're going to talk about the new ICANN CEO. Kieren, you're going to lead on that. But first of all, a little bit of fun, because it is the internet seriously. So as we start to get famous guests onto our little podcast from September, we're going to be asking them questions that are a bit like Room 101 and the desert island discs and things like that, so to try and tease out some little bits and nuggets from them. One thing we're going to ask is, excluding porn, and we say that really tongue-in-cheek, what's your guilty pleasure online? Kieren, do you have a guilty pleasure online?
Yeah, I do. My guilty pleasure online is not TikTok, but a specific segment of TikTok. And it is this, what do they call themselves? Citizen advocates or citizen lawyers. And there's a whole bunch of people who have been on the internet, have got their specific view of what the law is. This is almost entirely American, but it's because it's American. And then they go up in front of judges and argue their case and get destroyed over and over and over again. And there's something, it is a guilty pleasure, because you just think, oh God, and they're very confident, and they're doing it, and the judge just destroys them. You can see it coming, and then you see them realize that, oh, this is not going how I thought it would go. And it is awful. It's TikTok. So if you watch 4 of them, they give you more. Then they give you more.
Why go to law school when you could watch 4 TikTok videos and learn all the law you ever need? Well, it sounds like you don't need.
That's from our lawyer. Not too bitter there. So there you go. That's Kieren McCarthy's answered our first "What's your guilty pleasure online?" And there we have it, a citizens lawyer TikTok site. So Kieren, ICANN CEO.
Yeah, so they've finally named one. It's been a long time. Actually, I looked it up. It was the last one. Goran Mulby resigned in December 22. Then they announced a what do they call it? The search committee, CEO search committee, in March 23. So over a year ago. And then they've announced that Kurt Lindquist, is that how you pronounce his name? Who I don't know that well, but I mean, I know of him. He's been in just about every serious tech body for a long time. His IETF sort of stalwart IAB, I think he's been in. He was CEO of NetNod for a while, CEO of Lynx most recently in London. So a real like in the weeds internet tech engineer. He's been chosen, but he's not going to take the job until December. So it will have been 2 years since ICANN's had a formal full-on CEO.
Well, and just to be clear, we've in between. There's been Sally Costerton, who was their marketing chief, and she's been flown in as the interim CEO, the stand-in CEO. In the meanwhile, so Emily, what a white guy, an engineer, a European.
I think there's a feminist angle here. You know, Sally was the first woman to lead ICANN. As she said, you know. It was something that she stepped up to with very little notice, and I think she's done a very good job, actually. You know, I've not interacted with her very much, but on one issue, which is the preparations for the 20th anniversary of the World Summit on the Information Society, she is the first ICANN CEO I have ever heard who has been quite realistic about, you know, that not everybody in the world gets that multi-stakeholder governance is the new answer to absolutely everything. Some people don't believe that, and they don't agree with it. And it's not just because they're stupid or ignorant, it's actually because the multi-stakeholder model isn't working for everybody. And I felt like she had quite a humble and quite a real point of view, and was also under no illusions about how difficult it was going to be to get the multi-stakeholder community oven ready for what the challenge ahead.
So your view is that she was good for the job.
My feminist angle is, if you look at the rogues gallery, if you like, of former ICANN CEOs, Sally was at least as competent as anybody who's held that role. Why interim? And is it just because she's a woman, or was it for some other reason? And as Kieren says, if you have an organisation like ICANN, which is essentially in a kind of influx on its leadership for 2 years, in the run-up to a really, really strategically important challenge, then that leaves all of the staff, all of the community, really uncertain about which way to jump, and it means that the vital strategic planning which is happening, should have been happening a year ago but is sort of happening now, is now going to have a new person coming in with just a year to go, which sounds like a long time, but in a UN context it's not nearly enough time to do the sort of reorientation that really the multi-stakeholder process and communities, I think, need. And I agree with Kieren. You know, I've always heard great things about Curtis Lindquist, but he's definitely in the comfort zone. White male, mature Northern European guy, totally in the tech weeds, incredibly well respected by the tech community. So it's sort of more of the same from ICANN, when possibly they need somebody with a good political nous. And I don't know Curtis well enough to know how he will fit with that challenge.
So what you're saying is Sally seemed to be good for the job, given the threats in the far environment and what's happening generally with the movements in the internet. She seemed to be a pretty good bet. So Kieren, the ICANN board have got some other priorities on their mind. Where does Kurt need to take ICANN next that perhaps Sally wasn't going to be able to? And just to say, we don't know whether Sally's going to go. I mean, she might just continue doing their marketing and strategy, in which case this might actually free her up to focus more on that strategic input. But where are they going?
Yeah, so I was surprised that Sally stayed on. I think she's done a really good job, and she actually filled a big gap at ICANN in that she started to change the culture to be a little bit more open, a little bit more honest, a little bit less ICANN is the center of the universe, and sort of pulling in views and recognizing ICANN the role. I'm a little worried that ICANN has reverted back to getting in the sort of internet engineer, and I hope that they don't sort of revert back to some of their old culture, which was quite introverted, thinking that the tech's always the answer, and the word isn't arrogant, but certainly not considering deeply or properly the views of people that aren't engineers. And ICANN's always had that sort of struggle. So I thought Sally has been really good for the organization. And of course, all the technical knowledge is still there in the community. So we'll see where it goes. I hope she stays on. I mean, I imagine she probably wants to get on with other things in her life, but we'll find out. So who knows? I mean, ICANN is clearly, they wanted to choose a permanent CEO. They've gone for one of their own again, as we've had that mostly in the past. And we'll see what happens as a result. I would like to see, there's still big components of ICANN's culture that need shifting. And for example, we were just talking, I've been busy on the campaign trail, so I haven't been tracking what's happened at the ICANN meeting this week. But no one is putting out that information. It's not like there's an email coming in that's telling me what's going on. So you're kind of in that community or you're not in that community. And that's one of ICANN's biggest mistakes.
And we're very much from that community, being sort of ICANN 20-year, 25-year Emily lifers. Just to remind everyone, we do define ICANN in our previous episode, and we do sort of talk about what it is and why it's there. And we're talking about it this week because there's a lot happening. There's a big ICANN conference this week.
So Lucien, I can do a quick explainer on ICANN again, but first of all, let's go to you with one of our questions. So, Lucien, what is your Internet Room 101?
This is where you want to doom something forever, deem something gone forever, and it's your one thing about the internet that you decide if the internet didn't have that would just be fantastic.
Better. Yeah.
I think that the internet, the engineers of the internet, the content creators of the internet have gained what's known as GDPR, the GDPR laws, and basically thrown back into the European Commission, who actually developed these laws to protect citizens from having all their data tracked. And the internet community has answered that with two fingers in the air and said, right, okay, we're going to bombard websites with so many cookie notices that they actually become exhausting for the consumer. The consumer becomes inured to them, and they're just so used to them that you just try and click accept as quickly as possible so that you can get on with finding out what you want. And if you're like me and you're actually like, well, I'm not going to read this, I just want to reject these cookie notices, I now have to install software on my browser to sort of disagree with as many cookie acceptance notices as possible and get on with enjoying browsing the content of the internet. So if I also think the internet community lost a trick in standardization and standardizing cookie notices so that you can set your cookie permissions at browser level rather than individual website level. So I would put into that, I would walk it through the gates of Room 101 and hold it there until it dies. I would put cookie notices into that Room 101, and I'd want them to really suffer on the way out.
What do you think, Kieren? Would that be in your Room 101 as well?
I hate those.
Hate them. I hate them.
I would love to know how many people in the wider public even understand what the hell they're there for, what accept some, decline all. I bet absolutely nobody has any idea what they're doing.
No, and the worst ones are so I do try to kind of manage my settings, which I know is just a futile thing to do, but I go and do it. The worst ones, the best ones are like where you can press one button and say reject all. That's my favourite. But the worst ones are where you have to go through every single legitimate interest and manually tick them all to off. And then there's a whole other screen of their third parties as well. It's like hundreds of different settings just to go to a stupid website.
But you know what's really mad is I choose it according to what mood I'm in or what I think about the company, because it's so ridiculous that it doesn't actually bear any relation to what it's supposed to do anymore. So if I'm in a good mood, or if I like this company that I'm buying, I know, a bag from, I'll say, sure, have my cookies.
Yeah.
Or if I'm in a bad mood, it's like, no, You won't have any of my cookies. It means completely irrational.
It's completely irrational.
It's like giving a charity worker, we're talking about it as though you're giving a charity worker $1 or £1 on the way out. But you're not. If you look at the vendor sections of notices where you can read through pages and pages of people they share it with, it's abhorrent.
So scary, isn't it? Yeah.
Anyway, so I think we're all. That's great.
Oh, well, we agree with.
I think I chose a good internet.
It goes in, doesn't it? If we all agree, it goes in room 101.
Yeah,
it does. It goes so big.
And for the privacy nerds out there, it's the combination of the privacy and e-commerce regulations 2002 plus GDPR that have given us the current nightmare. So the law that the foundational law on cookies, and hats off to the European Commission for actually recognising back in, more than 20 years ago, how intrusive cookies could be for privacy and passing a law about it, but no one paid any attention until it was GDPR, turnover-based fines. The Americans all freak out. But another thing about it, and then we'll shut up about cookies, but another thing about it is, as apps rose up, all of the internet community that we know were like, don't talk about apps because they will kill websites. And it's like, apps are such a lovely place to be compared to the web if you're on a phone, because and so it's driving people away from the open web into the sort of closed app environment.
And that's analogous to what I call browser-based cookie setting, standards cookie setting. So just to give a little bit of credit to our team, behind the camera is Igor Weilemann, who's doing a fantastic job. We're in the second episode and it's already looking really interesting. And we've got Charlie Wickham, who's behind the microphones. Charlie, we need a big jingle next time for our Room 101 with a sort of doom if it gets already working on it. Maybe he's already working on it. And a lovely applausey celebration if, like me just now, I've got my Room 101 vote.
Yeah,
so
that
thank
would
you
be
very
great.
So finally, I think Kieren, you're going to talk to Emily about just the ICANN roundup this week.
Yes, I have not followed what's going on with ICANN. I've been busy, in my campaign thing. So I'd love to know what's happened. I don't even remember where they were meeting, but it was definitely this week, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it's the policy forum of ICANN, and it happened in Kigali, Rwanda. So just a quick explanation or recap of what ICANN is. ICANN is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, a California not-for-profit whose role is as a coordinator of the Internet's unique identifiers, which means domain names and Internet protocol addresses or IP addresses. And part of what ICANN actually does operationally is it runs the so-called root zone, the IANA database, which is actually the pivotal topmost node, the most powerful node in terms of coordinating those names and numbers. But it also plays through its community, multi-stakeholder community, it plays a role in forming policy for the generic top-level domain space. And that's what we had this week, Kieren. It's the policy forum happening in Rwanda. Well, first of all, let's just do
Rwanda, that's
word.
Interesting.
Well, let's do a word about the location, because it's not actually very often that ICANN chooses to go and have a meeting in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa.
Why not?
It does hop through the different continents and regions, but it tends to have a kind of a European and North American type of feel, a very developed world type of feel. And actually, in the context of the people and the regions who are left out of multi-stakeholder governance, sub-Saharan Africa is a really major role. In fact, the entire continent of Africa. What we saw when you hold a meeting in a region, what we see in our recent Internet Governance Forum paper that we did, is that when you hold a meeting there in the region, you end up with lots of people from that region. So it's a great thing to do, just be there in the region. So that was really positive. I agree with you, Kieran. It's actually, I didn't travel to Kigali. Georgia, one of our staff, did. It's actually not that easy to know what was discussed. It's also not that easy to know what was discussed even if you're there on the ground, because each community sort of does its thing in its little silos. They sometimes meet with each other and have sort of slightly kind of formalistic exchanges, which are a bit like a family Christmas dinner where people will use trigger words and see who explodes first. But one session I did catch was about actionable abuse reporting in the domain name environment, and a really, some really interesting work being done by NetBeacon on trying to standardise in a way, even informally, actionable abuse reporting and start to articulate frameworks. But what really struck me about that session was the volumes that they're talking about. So we had somebody from ICANN compliance, and they're really dealing in very low volumes of reported abuse.
Well, what is ICANN compliance?
So ICANN compliance is a department of ICANN that looks after the contracts with domain name registries who look after each top level domain like .com or .net, .org and so on. And also the registrars who are the retailers, people like Two Cows and GoDaddy. Now, they have certain obligations, and ICANN has a team who enforce those obligations. But as part of that, they do accept abuse reports, but they get something like a couple of thousand a year. And maybe 80% of those they view as invalid. So they're really dealing with a handful of reports. And it wasn't clear from NetBeacon what their volumes are, but it seemed to be a similar sort of order of magnitude.
Now, just to be clear, in contrast to our DAP.live abuse reporting platform, which consolidates lots of feeds, we're dealing with tens of thousands each month. So you've got this real disparity.
A real disparity. And if you sort of talk to internet service providers who are really down there in the traffic, they're dealing in seconds and responding to abuse reports in almost real time. So what really struck me with that conversation is, like, one, really good work. It's great to see, this conversation happening. But two, the low volumes and how isolated this conversation was. It was a 2 and 4 domain name registries and registrars only. There doesn't seem to be very much cross-sector collaboration whatsoever, and there seems to be a real disconnect, if you like, between the volumes that the people within ICANN are reporting and what the wider world is seeing.
Wow. So looks like a big job for Kurt coming up, trying to align what we call the signals market, where you've got almost white noise of threat signals out there that the ISPs, the telcos and others are reporting, and the what is regarded as abuse, internet abuse from the governors of the internet, who seem to be dealing with a much smaller order of magnitude, Kieren.
That's right. It just reminded me, it's taking me back. I actually worked for ICANN for over 2 years as their general manager of public participation. And you just reminded me that one of the things I used to try and do during the conference was I would produce a daily newsletter and go around and scour the most interesting things and then print it up and then hand them out to people and put them on the website so people could track what was happening. We always talked about how decisions were being made in silos and how that was making it much harder to make progress. And it feels like that hasn't shifted much. And the main thing is just communication. What's happening over here, go and tell the people over there, and then get them to feed back to you the next day. And it can happen at conferences. We made it work a couple of times, usually when there was a crisis of some kind. But it doesn't happen on the day-to-day. So I hope that the new ICANN CEO will recognize in an engineering type of way that communication and sharing information and data is going to make it all work a lot better.
When did you last go to an ICANN meeting, Kieren?
Oh, it was a long time ago. No, it wasn't that long ago. It was the one that they had in Amsterdam. When was that? 2 years ago?
Oh, I don't know.
Rather bewildering exercise, I must say.
I mean, one of the things that really strikes me kind of coming in and out of the ICANN environment every few years, it's like you go back there and it's all the same people, all your friends, but just a bit older. And the contrast again with the Internet Governance Forum that we saw in our recent study is like 60% of attendees at an Internet Governance Forum will tend to be newcomers. And I would doubt that it would be anything like that. And while there may be a cohort of newcomers who come into ICANN meetings through a very carefully cultivated and curated sort of newcomers tracks, they don't tend to stay. It tends to be a one and done. And this is an aging community, and I think that that's really and very self-referential and inward-looking. And I think part of the challenge for the new CEO is going to be to get this organisation facing outwards and encouraging new blood into it.
I'm not sure if I believe it's possible or can happen, but I think we've sort of got to the end of our 3 topics for this week. It's great to see you, Kieren. I can't wait for you to come into the studio, but we appreciate that in Putney you've got a very busy time happening down there. Thank you, Emily. I'd like to say thank you to our production manager, which is Katie Miles as well, who is behind the scenes there and has been helping transform this space into something that we can repeat every week. So this week we've talked about the Labour Manifesto and what it means for tech. The new ICANN CEO, I'm not going to attempt to say his name, and generally Emily's been doing a what's happening at ICANN. And we've also started testing our fun questions, which we're going to torture guests to be with when they come and join us here. So thank you very much. That's our 2nd episode of The Internet Seriously. Thank you.